Breaking news this hour. As many as 150 people have been injured in the Ukrainian capital, two-thirds of them policemen. Several arrests were made as protesters armed with tear gas, stones and metal chains broke into the city council building and tried to storm the presidential administration. Hundreds of thousands of demonstrators are on the streets despite a month-long ban on rallies in the center of Kiev. RT's Alexei Yaroshevsky is there.
It is still pretty tense in the Ukrainian capital. There's not as many people now as it used to be at the beginning of the protest, but still we're talking at least 100,000 people who are protesting in the street right now. We saw the protesters bringing in steel fences to cordon off some central streets of the city. We also do know that they have cordoned off governmental buildings, and we also know that the protesters have managed to overtake the city administration building, and now it's pretty much open for everyone to get in there. All the officials have left that building. Several hours ago, in fact, the administration of President of Ukraine building looked like a battlefield. Huge clash erupted between the protesters and the riot police. A short while ago, I went to the administration of President of Ukraine building to see everything with my own eyes. The building of the administration of Ukraine's president now under siege, with several hundred riot policemen protecting the building. They've set up buses so that the protesters cannot reach inside, and these few meters, basically maybe 20 meters between them and the protesters. We've walked here, we saw literally maybe several hundred of them over here. We see shattered glass. You can see probably over here some shattered glass on the ground, the rocks which were used to throw at the police. Several hours ago, the protesters, they tried to assault the building. They even used a bulldozer to try to break the police lines. As we can see, they failed. The police are pretty much in control over here, even though we're not even being let inside this perimeter because the policemen are fearing that the clashes may erupt at any minute. It's actually quite hard to speak here because of all the tear gas which was used. It's still pretty much felt in the air, and the situation is still very, very tense here. Throughout the whole week, they've been protesting against the government decision not to sign the EU association deal, despite that many economists and people in power saying that this deal could have harmed Ukraine economically. Still, this was not something on the minds of the people. But now, essentially, the protest is different. Now it's more about the rage of the people against the government, the president, believing that they are the ones who dispersed a peaceful protest on Friday night when several hundred protesters were violently pushed from the central square by the police. Judging by the fact that the steel fences have been set up in the city, it's really unlikely that the protest will die down anytime soon.
With neither government nor protesters willing to compromise, let's discuss where this standoff may land Ukraine. Well, for that, I'm joined by Martin McCauley, author and analyst on Russia. Firstly, Martin, let's just talk about Russia and the EU friction. Now, Russia's saying that there is a danger that goods could flood its markets via Ukraine, and so therefore it's threatening to impose customs, taxes, duties. An act of intimidation, so says Europe. I mean, that's a fair accusation?
Well, the protesters will see it as an act of intimidation. One of the complaints of the protesters is that President Yanukovych gave in to President Putin. I don't know whether this is true or not, but they actually believe that, and they would like Ukraine to stand up for itself and not to give in to intimidation. So therefore, this fuels, if you like, nationalism and the feeling that Ukraine is under siege and therefore it should defend itself. And the present government doesn't appear to be capable of doing that.
So what is the situation now in Ukraine? Is this a conflict between the East and West, or is actually a domestic crisis unfolding now in the country?
It's both, because if you take Ukraine, you can split it between the West, the western part, which is basically pro-European, and the eastern part, which in many ways is pro-Russian, speaking Russian and so on and so forth, and Kiev is in the middle. And the country is therefore divided. It's always been a divided country, even under the Soviets, because that part of Western Ukraine was in Poland until 1945, and that's carried over onto the present day. You can still feel the influence there. So you've got a conflict now between two groups who have completely different agendas about the future of Ukraine. The Western group, if you like, its capital is in Lviv and so on, and they're very nationalist. And they would like Ukraine to lean towards Europe, gradually become integrated in Western Europe and so on. But other Ukrainians think that, in fact, would be the death of Ukraine. Ukraine would be submitted to pressure, and it would be forced to do things it didn't want to do. And Ukraine should in fact look to Russia, which is traditionally its market. The two languages are not far apart. They're brothers, if you like. And this conflict now is boiling up and is now becoming one which is more and more nationalistic. The protesters, because of the violence, this is the first time really in Kiev that violence has been used against protesters. And the riot police are in a very, very difficult position because they have to decide whether, if they use force again, will Yanukovych and his government survive. If they believe they will survive, then okay, they can use force and perhaps crack a few heads. But if they begin to believe that the government will fall, then they will draw back and say to themselves, we want to be in the winning side, we don't want to be blamed by the next government for this violence.
Is it really getting that serious? And we are hearing protesters saying revolution, revolution, but is the Yanukovych government really in danger here?
It's in danger because Ukraine is weak, its economy is weak and so on, and living standards are disappointing, and therefore the people in the street very often are not rational, because it's very difficult to control a crowd. Once you get to 100,000, 150,000, 200,000, it takes on really a mind of its own and it can become extremely violent. You found this in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution of 1917. Crowds can in fact change things, and the police, riot police, and even the military. Will the military be brought in to control the situation? They will think twice about that because they have to work out whether the government falls. If the government's going to fall, then they'll not intervene.
And Martin, just briefly, there are allegations that European officials are in cahoots with the opposition at the moment there in Kiev. How should Russia be reacting to that?
Russia has to be very careful here, because if it comes out and blames the opposition on foreign intervention, it's based on foreigners, it's not really Ukrainian, it's really European, it's instigated from Brussels and so on. That will rebound against Moscow and will enrage the Ukrainians even more, the protesters even more, because they will say, we are Ukrainians and we don't take orders from anyone, we're not getting money or any instructions from Brussels or anywhere else. We are deciding ourselves. We want rid of this government. We want a government which will respond to the popular will. It will become, if you like, the popular will, popular politics. And that will be carried out on the street. And very often it's not very rational. Crowds, once they go beyond 100,000, 200,000, very often they can act very irrationally, because there are hotheads who can in fact instigate, perhaps they want some violence and so on, and then the situation gets out of control, because the riot police have to calculate whether Yanukovych and his government is strong enough to win. If they believe then they are, then they will defend the government and defend the buildings and so on. But if they begin to believe that the government could fall and Yanukovych would give way, then they will hold back, because in a different government, in a new government, they could be in fact blamed for any conflict and any violence that takes place.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. Martin McCauley, author and analyst on Russia, joining us live from London. Thank you. Well, here's why the Ukrainian government is under pressure right now. Thousands of protesters, as well as the opposition in parliament, want to move the country towards Europe. But the government thinks that is premature, saying Brussels is not offering perks such as membership and the privileges most Europeans enjoy. Then there's a belief that life closer to Europe would be cheaper. But the government warns the deal would actually damage the economy for little in return. The opposition still insists that Kiev should resist pressure from Moscow, but close economic ties with Russia, including a free trade zone, a shared business landscape, and also an increased exports, aim to pull the states together. Well, Associate Professor of Political Economy Geoffrey Summers says that the EU's trade relations with Ukraine have hurt the country.
If we take a look at eastward expansion by the EU, we can see that it has in the past produced deindustrialization in the east, labor migration from the east to the west. And so we've also seen West European consumer products dumped in the east. And I think that the EU is again experiencing, of course, in the past 4 or 5 years, economic crisis, and it sees further eastward expansion as a way to resolve their own problems in West Europe.
Some senior EU politicians have been blaming Russia for the events taking place in Kiev, saying it was pressure from Moscow that sunk the deal with the EU. And some of those politicians, as we said earlier, have been seen in central Kiev cheering the protesters on. International relations professor Mark Sloboda told us that is unacceptable under international law.
The fact that they are essentially on the ground in Kiev, cheerleading the protesters on, calling for a revolution in the country. This is tantamount to the regime change that has been called for in German newspapers earlier today. This is a most egregious violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, a violation of the sovereignty and the non-interference in the domestic affairs of other states. And I think Russia cannot take, the whole world community cannot take this egregious act lightly.
The latest news, updates, footage and photographs from Kiev can be found right now on our website, rt.com. And you can also log on to get up to speed with how the protest started and escalated into the current situation.